Alright, so finally let's get this video started by saying thank you all so much for joining in on this challenge. I didn't expect so many entries. To be honest, when I first started hosting this challenge, I thought to myself, oh, I do hope that there is going to be more than 2 entries, that I'm actually going to get some people that are going to want to join the challenge. Well, careful what you wish for, because I ended up getting about 40-50 submissions, which is part of the reason why it took so long to get this video going, because I did promise paintovers, and paintovers is what I've done. But aside from that, there's some other life stuff that I won't go too in depth into. But that does mean that this challenge in particular in the future is going to have to change format a little bit. So we'll see what we can do to actually get that going in a way where we can really help everyone still get the feedback they deserve, because I still think feedback is probably one of the most valuable things to get out of these challenges, so I don't want to give that up. So if you have any suggestions on how we can approach that in the future, feel free to let me know and we'll have a little bit of a discussion on that. The next challenge should be announced pretty soon. Maybe we'll do that after the New Year's, because the holidays are going to start coming up, and it's always fun to have January as a bit of a fresh start. Alright, but first let's get things started with our first paintover that I've done, which is a painting by Sanzo over on Discord. And the way I'll be doing this, I'll be addressing some of the key points I think that are going right and some of the key points that are going wrong, so you have enough of a foundation to work with, like enough information to work with when you approach maybe the next image. So this image itself, like the top one is always the original, that's already working quite well in my opinion. Like, we have a very interesting graphic composition, the eyes being led in the right direction, that's very cool to see. The color palette is quite appealing, but the problem with this image in particular, I would say, is twofold. So the first problem is going to be the values, and the values is the easiest thing to clarify as well, because if you just kind of look at how dark your values tend to go, like they go even to 1% from black, which is essentially jet black, and in painting, unless that's a very stylistic choice, that's not something we really want to do, especially when we have these kind of very atmospheric scenes like what you have. There's a lot of smoke, a lot of fog, which means there's going to be a lot of atmosphere interfering with the light being diffused, and that's going to light up in particular big chunks of the background. So rather than using a black, we could use like a dark bluish color instead. That might help a little bit more with getting that feeling of depth of this being a massive cavern. So the values is the first thing. It also helps separating this pillar from the background, which is also quite nice. Plus then we can really reserve those darks for the areas where we desperately need it. Now, aside from that, the second problem, aside from the value problem, is going to be more so shapes. And with the shapes, I'm talking more so about how we can use the shapes to make this scene feel cohesive, complete, like we are connecting all of the separate parts. So originally the painting really you had this section and this section, and those two sections weren't really intermingling, because your shapes start essentially, like we can draw a line between those shapes, which is never really a good thing. So you want to design the shapes where we're organically flowing from one area to another, like for example by redesigning the light coming in, so it's actually following the staircase a little bit and kind of diagonally going across that, as opposed to just kind of being a block on top of the block that is already the entrance. It gives it more of an organic, natural feeling, and especially if we can then sort of spread that out with like some other dappled lights here and there throughout the composition, the whole scene starts feeling a lot more whole. I also did pump the warmth of the light a little bit to contrast and complement the cools of the shadow, and that's, I think, the general point of advice for this image in particular. So I hope that gives you enough to go off of and continue on to your next painting. Next up we have a painting by Zenners, and Zenners has made a very cool and engaging scene that actually has a lot of storytelling, and I think that's a big accomplishment. It's actually quite difficult to pull off storytelling in an image. I'd say that's probably what people struggle with most. I'd say the issues with this painting in particular is that it's just too, like, the whole image is essentially in light, and it's therefore maybe a little bit more difficult to figure out what the first thing is we need to look at. Obviously the character here is drawing a lot of attention, but because of all of the small shapes and also again the values, they feel like they're a little bit messily distributed all around the painting. So the first thing I've done, and excuse the crude paint over, I'm just kind of trying to rearrange the shapes, but it is defining those shapes a little bit better, like throwing this character into shadow and then choosing very particular which parts are able to receive some light from the light coming in between the trees, as well as grouping a lot of those darks, and probably we could even push that further by sort of pushing a lot more of that painting into shadow. Like that way you can see we get a much more readable painting with sort of this narrow band of focus, like in this general area. Like this is now the focal point, and in your image we're sort of wandering across the entire image. So that's going to be the core message for this scene in particular, but you've done a really good job. It's a really cool composition and painting. I love the way you've set this up. To already move on to the next one, we have a painting by Bapt Art, and I think once again very cool painting, narratively very strong, graphically very strong, and the style is just very charming, really. And the charm is such a big part of general appeal and what draws people into specific art pieces. And I think that's already done wonderfully. Awesome to see. Similar to the previous feedback, I think this image mainly is suffering as well from having the values be a little bit too all over the place, not enough grouped shapes of light and dark. Because we can see that the values, like there's a lot of interchanging shapes of light and dark, like quite a lot, which makes it visually quite loud. We can see how, like when we especially turn it into black and white, we can see how this tends to get a little bit cluttered at times, and we want to separate certain shapes a little bit further. And even though the changes might seem fairly minimal, the first thing I kind of went for myself is I try to really separate the shape of the castle from the shape of the sky, by compressing the values of the sky and by darkening the shadow a little bit of the castle. Therefore we can also make the entrance of the doorway pop a little bit more, which is obviously quite nice. And we could even say, like, if you want to push that further, we could also push some of the warmth of that light coming out if we'd want to. Or if you want to make it feel a bit more eerie, obviously you can change the color of the light, and suddenly we can add like a little bit of mystical storytelling to the painting as well. Aside from that, the characters themselves, I've also darkened their silhouette, because their darker silhouette should also stand out from the background a little bit. So I'm enhancing the rim light on one side and choosing to add in that sort of fog effect on the other side immediately helps us sort of frame these characters quite nicely. Like value-wise, it's essentially we've created a bit of a checkerboard pattern from dark to light to dark next to it and then light next to it again. It's sort of the way I like to think about creating these value setups. So yeah, layering and grouping of the values I think is important. Also, don't go too dark in the background and you should be good to go. Like this is a really amazing painting. And I think it's just a little bit of fine-tuning, grouping shapes to push that to the next level. This one by Juno-san might seem like I've made a lot of changes, and technically I haven't changed a thing about the composition really, or at least not many things. The painting is essentially the same. It's mainly, again, you might start recognizing a theme, a value thing. And the values in this painting, much like the first feedback I've given, they're just getting too close to black. Like there's even pure blacks in there. And once again, you can do that if it's a stylistic choice for sure. But here, once again, we have sort of that atmosphere coming into play as well. And I feel like it'd be much more fun to play around with sort of the ambient colors that we get. We have sort of that teal-ish, like ghoul-ish color, as well as the greens. Like that really sets a tone for the atmosphere quite heavily. So brightening up the entire scene also allows us to then push perhaps some of the light being thrown around a little bit more. And the other thing aside from values, and once again you might start recognizing a theme, is going to be, we just want to crisp up some of these shapes. I think the shapes themselves aren't reading quite as well in certain areas, and the texture is kind of part of the cause of that. So texture, we want to be very selective with where we want to add that texture. We want to be fairly minimal. So it's mainly the design of the shapes being thrown in light, I think, that we want to emphasize. And if you want to add texture, really be suggestive with that. They can just be clumps of different colors. They don't have to be quite as grungy, because all of that noise tends to, well, be quite noisy in a composition. So that's something we, generally speaking, also want to avoid. But really nice narrative scene. It's very epic in scale, so that's awesome to see. So yeah, that's the first set done. Let's move on to the next set. Alright, for the next set, let's get ourselves started with Chris's work. And Chris's work already, once again, a very strong piece, just straight away, like really awesome to see. The lighting that you've used and the sort of frame within a frame is working quite well for you, and I think that's probably one of the stronger aspects of the composition as well as just the colors are generally speaking fairly appealing. Things I've done to enhance this painting, well, first of all, I think just a straight edge for a frame within a frame, it's usually not the most interesting choice of a shape to add to a foreground, because rather than allowing us to create like a more vast looking environment, it tends to sort of just crop the image, which makes most of this part of the painting kind of redundant. And we want the painting to add like a certain level of depth to the composition. The piece needs to feel larger than what we can see, and to do that we need, first of all, different layers, but also we can complicate that edge by, for example, having a little bit of negative space in between, by having some overlapping branches, and really trying to focus on how we can complicate those edges of that frame a little bit more. And we don't lose the graphic nature of the frame within a frame aspect you have, we just kind of enhance it by moving some of the other elements that we have to like repeat them essentially a little bit more when we get towards the foreground. And these other trees that we have really add in like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels of depth, as opposed to the 1, 2, 3, 4 that you had right there. You see? Same thing over here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 levels of depth, as opposed to the 1, 2, 3 levels of depth that you've added in the original painting. And that's kind of how we can enhance that composition, as well as, obviously, you've noticed that there's a theme in the way I give advice. It's sometimes stylistic choices as well, but those very dark blacks, try to avoid them. Get into the blues when you get into the background a little bit more. The more atmosphere is in between, the more the light's going to be diffused, so the more the dark shadows in the background are going to feel like lit up essentially. Plus that color contrast is quite nice between the warm green and the cool blue. Alright, next up we can move on to Bram's work. Bram's a friend of mine, so we've already discussed this painting. The advice here is fairly simple. Like he's obviously gone for a full-on 3D like scene, which means I can never really do a paint over that matches the level of finish. Unless I spend a long time. But the composition was working quite well, but I feel like the sense of scale was missing a little bit, plus some of those shapes, and this might be due to the use of 3D a little bit, but they feel a little bit artificial. Just too straight of a line, too perfect, very crisp of a shape, almost like you've just sort of put like a large plane in the background in the way of like the light source. I don't know if that's what you've done, but that's kind of what it feels like, and we want to make that feel a bit more organic, and the way we can do that is by actually sort of just adding in elements that break through that. So that can be a rock in the shadow that's going in front of the light shape. That can be a rock in the light that's going in front of the shadow shape. All of those small things can really add like a lot of dynamicism to a composition, which is essentially what we want to go for. We want to complicate the composition enough so that we have like still a nice and graphic composition, but it feels not quite as artificial, and therefore we can make it feel a lot more intentional rather than, or we can actually maybe it's a better way to put it, to hide the intention essentially. So part of what I was saying earlier about two perfect edges, making something feel perhaps like it's cropped and artificial, well, same thing over here. If we can sort of crop or like cut out of the silhouette of some of those shapes, that's much more interesting, and choose very particularly which parts or how we want to throw the light, and how we can, for example, throw the hands that are holding the sword in light a little bit more. It's creating much more clear diagonal angle, which also enhances sort of the zigzag composition that we have. The final thing is having, this is a hand by the way, I know it's not that clear, but having the hand sort of poke through from the shadow also makes it feel perhaps a little bit more immediately threatening, and adjusting the scale, shrinking him, also ups the sense of scale that we have. So yeah, awesome piece, very cool composition, very cool elements in the scene, just breaking through that like more artificial feel, and we should be good to go. Next up we have Damir Snyder. Let's have a look at your work, and the image as a whole, I can tell there's a lot of cool, once again, narrative storytelling going on, and I feel like one of the main things holding this painting back is maybe overly relying on texture, especially texture actually. It feels like there's a bunch of texture everywhere, which makes it quite difficult to read, and starting with a composition that has a bit more of a graphic read, once again thinking about shapes of light versus dark, is going to be more beneficial for these kind of compositions. So the thing I did, for example, that might help quite a lot is we move this, whether it's snow or waterfall or anything, we move that off to the side so that it passes behind the dark shape of the character, and it really helps framing the character's silhouette a little bit more, which was getting lost a little bit in the original scene. And that's one of the main things I would personally like to see in a scene like this. You want to see at least parts of the silhouette so the painting becomes more readable. Same thing over here, like enhancing perhaps some of the separation right there. It's quite nice. So choosing specifically which edges need to be visible and which shouldn't be visible, I think is important, and we can do that by also playing around with reducing information in specific areas, less texture, more clean shapes essentially, or at least keep the values fairly close together in those shapes. All right, next up we have Vincent, and I think Vincent has a fairly cool composition set up for him. The main thing in this case is, like, I don't really feel like I'm part of the story. Like, I feel like an outside observer, which can be the intention, of course, but at the same time, I think it would be more interesting to really get a little bit closer. We could even afford to get more close if we'd want to, but then you'd lose like a large part of the things you've already painted, so we can compromise a little bit. But that's really fun to mess around with, like how far removed from the scene are we, quite literally. So that's the main advice I have here, and aside from that, the only thing I've really changed was pumping up the warmth of the light, and adding like a little bit more of a crisp edge to some of the light shapes compared to the shadow shapes, and that's the main thing that sells this painting, I think. But the setup is there, the story is there, we just need to feel a bit more close to the action essentially. Then finally, for this set in particular, we have Sky's work, and your composition is already fairly strong, very graphic. Again, that frame within a frame, very, very fun idea for the composition. Like this works quite well. So the things I think we need to do differently here, and you can already see some of the changes I've applied. The main thing I've changed actually is the clouds, because I feel like the clouds right now, the way you've set them up, they're a little bit too literally an arrow pointing in the direction of the focal point, and we can take that a little bit more suggestively. So rather than having these literal arrows, we just try to design a shape that has a natural tendency in that general direction. It can pass behind it to add a little bit more overlap as well. So you can see we have actually different layers of clouds. Also making the clouds a bit more massive helps enhancing sort of the distribution of the lights and dark shapes. So now suddenly the terrain is much more separated from the sky because we have that bright buffer zone. It's also a fun way to sort of help separate the composition into different sections. And ideally we want to respect sort of our ratios, our big, medium, small, etc. In that as well. Plus I do think it helps sort of highlights parts of the silhouettes of these other characters as well, perhaps. Another thing that might be interesting is the blood right here sort of stops in this general area, but I think sort of spreading that around, and we could even afford to create like a trail perhaps going somewhere, like that might work as well to, once again, tie everything together, get a bit more coherence out of the composition. All right. Okay, let's see what we can talk about in the next set. All right, next up we can start with FDs, and this painting is really fun, and especially if you're saying like you're new to art, like I can tell that you're new to art, so that take it as a compliment. This is already a very, very strong, solid start. One of the new trends I'll be talking about for the coming group of submissions or groups of submissions is the use of your canvas. And I think a lot of people tend to not use their canvas optimally for the composition's sake. So right now you have a canvas that's this large, and the thing that's interesting is happening sort of right over here. And I would argue this could be a composition in its own, like even disregarding the rest of the painting. And that's because you've placed your character on the far right of the composition, looking to the right of the composition, so he's facing that direction. And subconsciously, we as viewers tend to, want to look at what people are looking at. So if we see a character looking in a specific direction, we want to know what they are looking at, and that is going to cause us to suddenly, disregard the rest of the composition, which is like a little bit of a shame. So I propose expanding the scene, moving the character off to the left-hand side, maybe slightly center, because also this opening is creating quite a nice funnel to kind of redirect the attention to the character. So putting him in front of that light shape in the background, suddenly we immediately look here, and then we start wandering. Then we start wandering in a different direction. And you can add a little bit more intrigue to the dungeon by maybe some iconography. You could push that a lot further if you'd want to, but again, due to time constraints with these paintovers, I limited it to just something that represents that. And maybe even expand the scene with like an abandoned cart. Maybe there can be like remnants of other travelers who haven't been there, like an old campsite that's not being used anymore, something like that. Expanding the story, because right now it's a very nice painting. The narrative is maybe the thing that is missing at the moment, but really, really cool job. Next up, we can look at Thomas's work. So Thomas, you've done like a splendid job. Like most of the suggestions I've made, by the way, I think at this point they're a little bit subjective, not objective. So feel free to take it or leave it if you want to. I think the composition as a whole works really well. The scale is fairly grand, which is quite nice. The design of the statue is very interesting as well. The framing works. And I think the main thing that I wanted to push further is, once again, color contrast, because we have warm light coming through, and you've also kept the shadows quite warm, which is not a bad thing. It just means we're not quite as honed into the focal point as, for example, what I've done, where I've maybe imagined there's an opening in the ceiling that lets some moonlight through or something, so we get some of that cool diffused, light coming through, which should help also create that color contrast on top of that value contrast, because the value contrast is really notable. And I kind of dialed that back to create room for the color contrast, for the temperature shift, essentially, to make sure that this is still reading nice and interesting, and that we're focusing on that. So I think that's the main goal, especially since we have a water in the scene. Water tends to evaporate, tends to diffuse light. So we're going to get a lot of ambient light as well. All right. So next up, we will have a look at Ocean's work, and I've chosen one of your submissions to use as an example, but this sort of applies to most of them. I think the composition is the main thing that's not quite working, but the painting and the quality of the design, I think, is really fun, and you can definitely tell that you know what you're doing. But with this one in particular, I thought this one was interesting to illustrate some points that I have addressed already in this video even, and that's using our shapes that we have to our advantage to create a more clear focal point. So right now, our character is a dark shape in front of a dark shape, so he gets lost. We don't really see him at all, really. So I would push him to the foreground, make sure that he is overlapping with that light shape. Therefore, we can once again enhance that focal point, which helps bringing a little bit more attention to said focal point. You've also pushed most of the top of the building into the atmosphere, and it's not a bad thing if you want to stay in this specific area, but I also think the building itself is quite an important part of the composition. So framing that by adding some light clouds behind the dark shape of the roof suddenly helps kind of focusing on parts of that silhouette. Parts of that silhouette essentially get revealed, like right over here, for example, by choosing to add a light shape behind that. And I think that's probably one of the easiest ways to kind of punch up the focal point a little bit more. But yeah, awesome job. This is the main thing I was noticing in this situation, at least. So hopefully that helps you out. Moving on, we can have a look at Simonov. Sorry if I butchered that. And your painting also compositionally cool, nice setup, very sort of grim, dark aesthetic, which is not a bad thing. The main thing, similarly to what I've already done in others, trying to get rid of perhaps some of the blacks. Now, if there's any sort of composition where you can afford to get these blacks, it's when you have a deep dark cave. So you get some creative freedom there. But what we can do to create this composition in a bit more of an interesting way is frame it better. So once again, we have a character off to the left-hand side of the composition, facing the left side of the composition, sword aimed in the left side of the composition. So it makes the viewer want to look in that direction of the composition. And the shape of the tail is kind of just further enhancing that feeling of we're driven off the side of the frame, which is not ideal. So repositioning him, so he might still be facing his chest in that direction, but the look is going into the direction of the creature. And therefore we are turned back. You can also design the tail so it starts wrapping around. So we essentially create this closed loop of a composition. So the viewer will always sort of remain in this specific area. And you can see, like, adding a little bit of the head that's catching the light also helps creating sort of that overlap. And that's what we really want to do to enhance the composition. Also using the fog as to our advantage to enhance sort of the readability of parts of the silhouette. We can obviously use it to hide things, but we can also use it to show things in specific areas where we want to. So once again, redirecting the attention by looking how you position your character and how you position your shapes, and adding a little bit of overlap between the different elements. And that's really what should help with redirecting the eye to our character, which is then going to look over there, and we're going to redirect our eye over there. We want to look where the creature is looking, so we'll end up at our character again, and we'll end up back in the loop essentially. And that's kind of the sort of composition we ideally want to be able to create. Then finally, for this set of paintings, we have Killian. Another one of those scenes where the suggestion maybe is a bit more suggestive rather than like subjective, rather than objective. So the original version already works quite well. Graphic in nature, if it's graphic and readable and it looks intentional, it's a success, and you've accomplished that quite well. I think where we can push once again the focus a little bit more is color contrast. So right now, warm character, warm environment, cool floor, which makes us stick to the bottom a little bit more, but we don't really have a reason to go up and down. I think by introducing a gradient from warm to cool, and then having this warm character right there, we are slowly, softly, gently being led into that direction, as opposed to just going straight here and staying there. So this creates for a little bit more, I think, of an appealing, gentle flow through the scene, as opposed to the harsh impact that you maybe have right now. Plus, again, it enhances that warm focal point that we already have. All right, next up, let's begin our feedback with, give me a second, it is going to be Desrant's work. And Desrant had a very, very unique and like powerful piece immediately. I think the colors and the shapes are so satisfying. It's hard to really focus on what's maybe not working as well if you have such a generally aesthetically appealing painting. But there's a few things I think that are subtle changes that can enhance a composition like this. Right now, everything here of the silhouette of the building tends to maybe get lost a little bit. And because of the light, the fact that it stops right over there and continues all the way to the edge over here, I think that maybe creates a bit of a imbalance in the values. And with the values of your painting, we can see like this is all just one shape. And I have lit up the things behind the silhouette of the building as well as right over here to add some empty negative space and enhance that contrast there, to show a little bit more of a clear sense of depth in the composition. And I do think that is definitely added value. Again, a subtle change, but an important one nevertheless. Aside from that, in the foreground, I've also increased the contrast a little bit because I think the separation between our sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of depth, that can be enhanced a little bit as well. And even keeping that into account, you know, we have this area of like a tiny story being told, but the story gets lost because the rim light, it just isn't enough for us to really understand what we're looking at. So if you want to bring more attention to that, what we'd ideally need is either you enhance the light shape so that perhaps more of the animal for more of these character shapes is actually in light. Therefore, we can put a little bit more focus on that specific area without us necessarily having to compromise a lot, because the rim light almost never really is just a line. So that's one solution to this problem, and you can see how that does make a difference in making sure that this is now also something we need to look at. The other solution is to just kind of push this scene that's happening over here into the foreground more, so we can actually overlap our character with the bright shape we have over there, and then perhaps we'll have like the entire horse shape of the horse not wanting to continue in this general area, and therefore we can once again create perhaps a little bit more depth, because now we're utilizing the entire foreground and the background, and the scene perhaps feels a little bit more like we're being sucked in towards the dungeon. You see? So those are two suggestions of solutions essentially to this problem. So yeah, see whatever solution you vibe with more, what you like more to, and what you would like to apply to your paintings in the future. All right. Next up, we have Jefferson's work, and Jefferson, once again, a very good, strong painting, simple composition, which I like quite a lot because too many people tend to get too overly ambitious when they want to give themselves a task of a composition of a painting. And I think a simple subject done well is usually the better choice, especially when you want to have like a story that's being told. So I think the broken doorway is a very interesting choice to have in a scene like this. So that's already composition, like conceptually a good way to kind of add a little bit more interest to this. But I've really only changed one thing in this entire scene, and that is sort of the direction of the light shape. So again, shape design is important in leading the eye a particular way. And right now, because you have sort of this horizontal line going through, anything above that line kind of feels redundant. Once again, it feels like you're cropping things, especially because it sort of mirrors the line that we have on the floor, which is also not something ideally we'd like to see. But by turning this into almost like more of a triangle shape, essentially now we have multiple triangles in this composition. When we have our big, medium, small even in the composition a little bit more abstractly, which works quite well as using the shadow of the character to sort of hide part of her animal companion. And then we can also bring a little bit more punch to the fact that he is partially in the light and partially in shadow. I think this is a good way to tie things together in a composition. In your case, we just didn't really have that happen. So something like that should make this scene feel a bit more dynamic, a bit more interesting. Subtle changes go a long way in these kind of simple compositions. Next up, we have Kiwiba. And Kiwiba, in your case, painting, awesome, very well, as opposed to the previous one, very ambitious scene. Like whenever you have sort of a glowy effect, it's always more difficult because then we're working with multiple light sources, which is quite tricky to manage. And the thing with multiple light sources is you want to paint it at first as if it has only one light source, and that's going to be the main light source. Then afterwards, shine the light of the second light source on top. So you have to decide if the light coming from like the dungeon is the most powerful light, or if the light coming from the sky is the most powerful light. In this case, it's kind of tricky because you have painted it in a way where it's supposed to be quite bright. But yeah, so the first thing I did, and this is once again part of the theme of the video, is going to be the values I've adjusted, and specifically the values of the darks. So in the background, less black, more color, and we can really use once again that warmth to kind of be diffused throughout the entire scene, get that orange to kind of creep through, so we can really add more of a punch to the cool light source we have right over there. I think that works quite well. And with the character as well, careful when you add rim lights. Again, a rim light is never really a rim. It's never really just a line. It's always going to be a shape bleeding into the entire thing. And that's something we'd ideally want to see as well. And we can also do a little bit of redesigning of the shapes on the floor, for example. Imagine the terrain isn't perfect. Sometimes we might get a bump or a little patch of grass that sticks out a little bit further than the rest. And we can really start designing that shape to help us like create like a little bit more of an organic flow, keeping our perspective in mind. Like if you don't have any inorganic, like any geometrical structures in a composition, then we just need to hint at perspective by having sort of these shapes that are increasingly getting wider as we get further away from the horizon line and more narrow as we get closer to the horizon line. And that's a good way to sort of help enhancing that perspective without having to actually draw in perspective, you see? Yeah, and aside from that, values, getting rid of the blacks, introducing some color, that's really the main big change, I'd say, for this. All right, next up, let's move on to Sidian. And Sidian, awesome work, kind of similar to the painting by, I think it was Zenner's painting that I discussed in the second or in the first set. It's a cool setup, very narratively driven, very nice to see. Everything is equally lit up though, and that's I think the main problem at the moment. It seems like it's a nighttime scene, so we can really push the character into the shadow quite heavily, and if we want to have like a little bit of like light from the moon sort of shining through still, like we can definitely still do that to sort of frame some of the character a little bit more nicely. Like that's not an issue. The issue is we want the silhouette for the most part to be fairly simple, so that those rim lights actually get a chance to shine, get a chance to leave quite a big impact on the painting as a whole, because this way you can see like immediately we go from something where everything's interesting to something where we really tuned in to the focal point specifically. So increasing the amount of atmosphere, having that orange light kind of bleed into the rest of the scene, and darkening the silhouette of the character with that rim light also adds a little bit of a sense of mystery, which I think adds a new dimension to the story that's being told as well, which obviously is good for a large amount of reasons. Next up, we have, here we go, loving art. And I think this composition was a bit tricky to critique because you spend a lot of time creating a very appealing painting. But compositionally, it felt, to me at least, felt a bit disjointed. So even though the painting is quite nice, and the composition feels very, very graphic and intentional, it's technically two paintings, one could argue. So we have painting to the left and painting to the right, because there's really not a lot of interaction. Like even if we look at, for example, this tree and where the roots stop and this tree and where the roots stop, there's no sort of interaction there. We have all of the elements sort of next to each other rather than overlapping with each other. So if I would adjust the composition from the start, things that I might change is I might decide to have the staircase go entirely over there and then maybe have trees in front and trees behind to add a little bit of overlap. And then we can even say like we push that a little bit further, so we cross that center line and we tie the left to the right. And then maybe rather than having these two big trees, we can sort of have like a forest of overlapping shapes essentially to once again tie everything together. So that's the changes that I would ideally make if I would start the composition. But that doesn't mean the painting doesn't work right now. Like I said, it reads very intentional, so you sort of get away with the symmetrical composition you've set up, and it's actually quite appealing in a certain way. But the changes that I suggest are still going to be kind of tied to that, but also to choose a dominant focal point. Right now, I don't know if it's the trees, I don't know if it's the ghosts, I don't know if it's the character, because they're sort of all equally important based on the values and the colors you've set up. So I've chosen to highlight the ghost. So adding more of the spectral energy, excuse me, adding more of the spectral energy and adding a little bit more color to that, since the entire painting overall is fairly neutral in color, immediately draws the eye in over here, and it ends up giving sort of this general flow to the composition. All right, so we've already have 4 sets done. We have a few more to go, unfortunately. I'm really speedrunning through this. But we'll see what we can come up with for the next couple submissions. All right, let's see if we can cover the next set. So first up, we have Baronen, or however you pronounce it. I'm going to be butchering a lot of names in this video, by the way, so please bear with me. But this design in particular, or this painting in particular, it's working very well when it comes to the atmosphere you're trying to set. Like, I really like the sort of God Ray mood that you have, like in the forest. The miniature vibe also works quite nicely. But the thing with like stuff like dappled light and God Rays is that's the kind of painting where we really want to choose the like we would with like a camera, the exposure rate at which we're essentially painting. So that means how much information do we want to condense in the light side of the painting versus how much information we want to condense in the dark side of the painting. So in this case, your shapes are a little bit all over the place. They're just tiny shapes scattered around, which is generally speaking not the most interesting idea. So even if you're doing dappled light, see if you can group these shapes together to create like nice and appealing shapes. And also preferably not too many of them. Someone once told me that ideally you have like 5 separate shapes of light and dark to create the most coherent painting. So the way I've set up this painting in particular, I wanted to highlight parts of the silhouette of the tree trunk, because obviously that's a pretty big part of the scene. Like, that's the focal point, that's where our character is headed. And I wanted to highlight our character itself, and we can do that by just choosing to have a light shape behind the dark shape, in case of the character, for example, or a dark shape behind the light shape if we would go the opposite direction. But these values are really the main way we can very easily put a bit more emphasis on specific parts of the painting. All right, next up we have Josh. And Josh, this is a painting where I think you're at a pretty solid foundation already. If I would have any suggestions left, like beyond the paint over that I've done, is to probably repeat these structures to add a little bit more depth. So what if we have like another one of these statues right over there, and then maybe like another one all the way in the background, shrinking them further down, adding more dimension to the scene. First of all, that's going to be a big part in making this feel grand and like a vast environment, let's say. Aside from that, your values are also a little bit too all over the place, in the sense that we have our dark values equally dark in the background, and usually because of atmosphere, especially on an ocean where you have a lot of moisture in the air, a lot of particles in the air that are being thrown around, they're gonna diffuse the light, which is gonna brighten up those values in the background a little bit. Aside from that, kind of what I was talking about earlier as well, less shapes, so grouping shapes together to get a bit more of a interesting shape design, but also reduce the amount of information so the painting becomes a bit easier to read. Next up, we'll move to Alessandro. And I think your painting has a very unique and grungy style, so don't mind me cleaning up some of these shapes. Like, that's just partially because the brush I use and the speed at which I need to do these paintovers in order not to spend like an outrageous amount of time on this. But to me, there's a bit of a composition thing happening here, where this is a very interesting part of the painting, and nothing's really interacting with that part of the painting. So what we can see is we have a character looking in that direction past the cave rather than at the cave. So I flipped him around so he's looking in the direction of the cave. You could even afford to probably put him either closer into the foreground or alternatively put him further into the background so he's still looking in that direction. So those are the options to kind of compromise there. Aside from that, it felt a bit unbalanced with all of this darkness and information over here and then just a tiny shape over there. So I wanted to bring some of that shape language back into the right hand side, because I do think that also helps kind of tie everything together neatly. All right. Finally, for this set, we have, let's see, this is a painting by Jasilio. And the painting originally, once again, very cool idea, the hermit crab monster dying. That's a terrifying thought to just walk on the beach and have that creature kind of pounce onto you. The main changes I've made is going to be, again, reducing information and simplifying. So if you think about how we want to get the silhouette of a character to read, once again, think about the values you're choosing to use. So usually a sky gradient already has a bit of brighter value down low. It's going to be darker up high, which means for the silhouette, we kind of want to do the opposite. We want to have the darker value down low and the brighter value up high, which means the torch itself is casting a light on the side of the face, which is going to create a bright value be in front of that dark value, which is going to draw more attention. Now we could probably afford even to push that value further, like the torch is pretty close, so we can actually make that quite a lot brighter if you want to. And that immediately brings the attention to our focal point, which I think is important to note. This also helps reduce information because the impact of the torch, like we have a little bit of light fall off, so the light's going to have less and less of an impact. I'm not just going to equally throw light on here, because that's just going to create more and more distracting shapes. The hermit crab that you had is placed perhaps a little bit awkwardly, also because it's just one, and it's just sort of staring at us, which is kind of creepy, which, if that's the intention, awesome. But I also think we can sort of create more of a rhythm by having multiple sort of looking at him from different angles. It kind of helps steer the eye into this general direction, which is quite nice. And the final thing I would say is the shapes of the cave themselves. Right now there's a little bit too much repetition in the width of these bands, for example. That's not the most interesting, like having continuously repeating patterns. So you can definitely simplify that quite a lot, and by adding some of these elements over here, we can sort of create a curve. That's not a curve, but it's sort of a connected dots sort of curve, that helps steer the eye back into the direction of the focal point. All right, so that's going to be set number 5. Only 4 more to go, I think. So let's have a look at set number 6. I really did summarize it, like shorten these names, so sorry if your name is not pronounced correctly. But let's start off with Jace. And Jace, very epic scene. It almost feels Zelda-like, and maybe that's because of the color palette. I don't know, something about it screams Zelda to me. And I think the painting as a whole works. It works fairly well. Where it's maybe not necessarily working is, I think once again we need a little bit more of that graphic readability. So merging shapes, using less texture in certain areas, but also just slightly refining the shapes to get a more coherent composition. So the thing that I've done is I've tried to put a bit more of a clear distinction on the difference between what's in light and what's in dark value-wise by really trying to separate the top of the skull from the side of the skull, for example. And I've tried to enhance the silhouette of the skull cave as well with just shifting, or by shifting the clouds over to the side. Like this immediately helps us bring out or put a bit more attention to the more interesting part of the skull cave design, which is going to be the horns. So those parts of the silhouette I really do want to emphasize. So I'm very carefully choosing to add these cloud shapes behind there to help with that. And the benefit here is, like, I can also suddenly emphasize parts of those other silhouettes of the surrounding mountains. So we sort of create a 1, 2, 3 breadcrumb trail that leads into the focal point once again. So I think that's important to note. The other thing that felt kind of weird to me was him just standing on this singular rock on the lake. Like, how did he get here? get there? Why did he jump on top of that one? There's no way to continue without getting wet. There's no way it would, like he would have jumped from another one that's within a reasonable distance. So think of it as a video game. Turn it into a parkour section. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Probably could even afford once again to start adding more. So it's more of a like skipping section where you can sort of jump your way to the cave. So we can really clearly identify the path that the character needs to take. All right. Next up, I wrote an epi. So let's see. The similar, you know, the composition, very, very fun. The setup that you have, very, very cool. The scenery, I think, works quite well. The composition could be enhanced a little bit by just shifting things around. And it's also, once again, a situation where we want to reduce information. Less information is going to be important in this case. One of the main mistakes that people tend to make when they're doing these kind of scenes, especially if they're a bit more ambitious, they tend to want to show everything. So, oh yeah, this is a bush. That bush maybe has separate leaves and flowers. Same thing with the leaves over there. Like, how about I make it look like leaves by adding in like almost a dot for every single leaf? Like, that's not necessary. We can greatly reduce that information by just choosing, rather than, you know, having multiple dots for a shape. Like, I could just as well say I'll do a dark shape, and I'm just gonna butcher this real quick. And I'll do like a light side to that shape, and rather than painting every single leaf, I'll just sort of, on the transition area, focus on painting parts of those leaves, but really try to simplify it still, so it's still one shape. And then on the inside of those shapes, you can still choose to perhaps use different colors, different values to enhance certain parts of that, but we're not going to paint every single bit. We're just going to focus on painting parts of the texture, essentially, in the areas where it would be more noticeable. So those transition areas between light and dark would be important to cover. And that's the more appealing way to get something like a foliage texture going. So reducing information, very, very important to do when we're working with these compositions that have a lot of interesting elements to them. But the biggest thing is I unified the color palette. I brought everything within those cool blue tones, almost turning it into a monochromatic painting. And I moved this character off to the right-hand side so we can approximate that rule of thirds a little bit more. Probably could afford to expand the canvas a little bit outwards so this doesn't feel too cramped. So that might be an interesting idea as well to tackle, by just adding a little bit more space to the left-hand side to give it a bit more breathing space. You see? All right. Let's then move on to K. This was a difficult one because it's already very, very, very solid. Like, the rendering is gorgeous, the lighting works very well. I think in this case, and you almost get away with it because it feels like a stylistic choice, but again, you've heard me talk about the pure blacks, or the close to pure blacks in this in painting in general. So that's something I would try to avoid. And the first thing I sort of did was I grabbed those blacks and I once again just turned them into a color. Still use the colors of the environment to set the tone a little bit more, but also I worked on reducing some of that information and making the separation between what's in light and what's in dark a little bit more clear. Because some of the bright values in the shadow side of the statue were just a little bit too bright, causing a couple of distracting elements, so it became a little bit confusing in certain areas. Definitely something I would ideally want to avoid, as well as sort of pulling this brightness a little bit further and really showing that transition between the tail that's in light and the tail that's in the shadow. That way we can push the readability of this specific thing. Like, this is something you had to discover in your painting yourself. While here, I think it's a bit more likely to end up there without necessarily having to rely on those very dark contrasts. Like, we can still do that with just shapes and temperature contrast. Also enhance the ambient occlusion a little bit in specific areas to bring out the focal point a bit more. And that's really all I've done. Like, it's nothing spectacular, but it's reducing information, getting rid of the blacks. I think it does enhance the atmosphere of the painting. Right. I wrote down Sof. I don't know if that's Sophie. I should probably take a look at the actual names of the entries. But hey, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section if I got it wrong. Like that's completely fine. So you can see that with the painting, there's one notable thing I've done, and it is extending the canvas. The canvas itself that you had right now, it could work if your composition is a bit more horizontal. With composition in general, we want to think about the aspect ratios, meaning if it's a portrait or a landscape format or a square format, and what they bring to the table in terms of advantages for the composition. So a landscape composition will encourage the viewer obviously to look left to right. A portrait composition will encourage the viewer to look up and down, and the square composition will encourage the viewer to really zoom in on a focal point. So that means this is good to contain a specific subject. This encourages drifting to the sides, this encouraging drifting to the top or to the bottom. So if I then alternate this, for example, with a vertical focal point, suddenly I have something to bounce against, and the viewer is going to look at that. So the gate might serve very well as in that specific purpose. While with the landscape one, if I put a horizontal element, same thing, I will bounce against that and I will stop there, and that will now become a focal point. But the way you've set up your scene right now is it could be done either or, I think, but because of the placement of your wizard, we sort of have this diagonal, which to me feels like we want more of a height difference. We want to see more of what's below him. Also because you cut off the poor man's feet, and that's, generally speaking, never really a good idea in a composition to put a character in the scene where you're just cutting off the feet. It will just make it feel a little bit claustrophobic and cramped. So giving it a tad bit more space, it also shows us where the character came from, which is quite nice to see. And aside from that, again, similar to what I've been doing all video, for the entire video, is I've separated these groups of light and dark a little bit more by both compressing the values in each specific group, but also by increasing the color contrast. So the light in this case warm, the shadows cool. It's not always the case, but in this case I think that's definitely beneficial, and we just get a bit more of a graphic and appealing scene that way. We can bring some of the leaf textures, some of the overgrowth into the light and into the shadow, and that way once again enhance the composition. Whew. All right, so I think we're going at a pretty strong pace. So let's move on to the 7th group. These ones had some interesting entries as well. Sometimes the changes I suggest, by the way, are very minute, which means, well, good job to you. But I'll always sort of look for the main useful points of critique, essentially, for each painting. So I won't cover every single flaw. I won't cover every single good thing. I'll just focus on the things that I think you would benefit from most with this composition in particular. So let's start over here. We have a composition by Trukov, however you pronounce it once again. And the scene itself, it's once again a very simple scene, but I think because of that, we can get like very, very effective compositions out of a scene like this. And that's very, very fun to play with. Now, because you have so little going on in the composition, we do want to use those simplified elements to our advantage to help enhancing the scene the most that we can, essentially. So the tiles might not seem important because once again you have so little elements going on, I would just give them a tad bit more love. And usually the way you paint like repeating patterns is we want to avoid drawing every single outline of every single tile, because that's usually gonna end up feeling like a little bit like a sketch layer as opposed to a finished layer. So with lines specifically and with texture, kind of the same thing. What I like to focus on as sort of a rule of thumb is the start and the end of the line is probably going to be the more important part. So in this case, that's going to be the intersections between the tiles. It also makes a lot of sense to emphasize those because that's where we have the deepest sort of crevices, because this is where four corners kind of connect, which is going to create like a little bit of an opening. So light's going to have more difficulty reaching those areas. So we'll end up with something that creates some ambient occlusion, while in between there, we don't necessarily have that. To paint texture as well, we want to show slight like changes of level with these maybe more rough tiles. And what we can do is we can just sort of get our different colors going. So we have the cool colors of the sky being reflected essentially, and we have the warm colors of the torchlight being reflected. So we can just sort of alternate some of those. If you think some of them are a little bit too noticeable, then we can just sort of reduce the information by once again getting rid of that. And it's a very easy way to add like a tad bit of texture to this. Important thing is the values of those textures. They can be different, but they should still be fairly close together, so we're not creating two distracting shapes. Because if I would say, oh yeah, wait, this is catching light as well, it's too far away, and that's immediately quite distracting. Even if I want to blend that in, that's not going to work. So compress that information, compress those values, that's important. The other thing is, since you have a fairly directional light source, you know, your torch is over here, it's able to cast light in all of these directions, we're going to end up creating like a very strong cast shadow, because we have this very bright light source so close to the edge, which is going to help us with sort of emphasizing the difference between, once again, what's in light and what's in dark. This also creates perhaps a fun opportunity to show off things that should be hidden. So what if on the inside of the shadow right over there, we'd want to paint like a creepy crawly that's sort of waiting for him, and suddenly, you know, we're adding quite a lot of story to this tiny little composition. So I think that's probably a fun idea to mess around with. Especially with this sort of setup where it's fairly minimalistic composition, we have a lot of opportunity to enhance the scene quite a lot by just adding like these little tiny elements, and that should probably leave a pretty big impact. All right, moving on. We have Hel Tonesli, and your composition, again, we're starting to perhaps recognize some patterns in the things I focus on with painting. The composition itself is working, nothing wrong with that. The thing that isn't working is the value distribution, because your values are a little bit all over the place and we can't really identify where the separation is between light and dark, even though we have this opening that's, well, casting light on the inside of the dungeon. So the first thing I did is enhancing sort of that edge between the shape of light and dark, immediately creating a bit more of a graphic composition by brightening that behind the area behind the knight and darkening the knight's silhouette itself. We can also enhance how readable he becomes, and therefore how much of a focal point he becomes as well. Also darkening the inside over there. If you can use darkness anywhere, it's going to be the inside of a dungeon or a cave or an entrance. So keep that in mind. That's always a fun thing to try to focus on. Right, next up we have Thibaut. And Thibaut I didn't really do all too much. I think the main advice in this case is I want to be closer to the scene because I cannot identify what this is from this distance. So either we want to figure out a way to show that a little bit more clearly. Perhaps we could even do like a few of them where we have like multiple divers like floating around. Maybe we can have one diver right over there, and we can sort of show the silhouette of another diver that's a little bit closer by, going to investigate, and suddenly, you know, the scene becomes even more clear. But I want to be more involved with the scene. Like, even though the scale is pretty epic, more involvement is always a good idea. I also think if you have like creatures floating around, more of them, like use them as a way to really steer the eye back into the direction of the focal point. That's the general idea in that situation, at least. And we can have actually quite a lot more of them if we'd want to. But also, even though it's underwater, reducing the amount of darkness in specific areas should also do the trick with helping create these more unique compositions. I believe next up, it's gonna be not David's. This one was Gustav's. All right. So this is a sort of composition where it's really just tiny tidbits of advice for you. The painting itself works. I have no real quarrel with anything that's happening. I did enhance the vignette a little bit by enhancing the darkness in the top left corner. And you can see that the placement of the chains is something that I also wanted to use as a suggestion to create a more notable sort of pattern. Right now it felt a little bit like there was a disconnect between the left side of the composition and the right side of the composition, because there isn't really any sort of like these shapes are just present over here, and I think by bringing them forward into the foreground and even having them sort of continue all the way over there, adding more of them sort of dangling around, suddenly the composition starts feeling a little bit more like it's a coherent whole, like everything belongs together in the same scene. I'd also be tempted to bring the light in further, so we very clearly cross through that center line and we have a little bit more connection between the left hand side of the scene and the right hand side of the scene. So we can't really draw that vertical separation between these two focal points, but we rather have these shapes that are sort of wedged inside. That's always a good thing to try to apply, to try to look for essentially. What you could also do, and this is more of a subjective suggestion, like imagine there might be a crack somewhere that's also allowing some light to go through. So maybe we'll have like a couple of repeating patterns of sort of dappled light that might help tying things together a little bit more as well. It's just fun to mess around with these sort of things. I think light is always a fun tool in compositions, especially when it comes to making things feel perhaps a tad bit more coherent. All right. So aside from that, let's move on to Drawsin. And in your case, I did redo most of the background because I thought the main thing that was holding this painting back is the fact that, let's see, we have a very clear line above which nothing else is happening and below which everything is happening. I think that's usually not a very good design choice, because this way, you know, we end up creating a scene that has an area that feels perhaps a bit redundant, and having everything be sort of the same height, also not the greatest design choice. Two options here: lift up the character is option number 1. I went for option number 2, lift up the entrance of the cave. Also, once again, getting rid of the blacks, replacing them with a little bit of atmosphere does a good job usually at creating these more appealing scenes. And rather than having just these two people, have a crowd, and even add some up top, like really close the characters in. I think that's gonna play a big role in making it feel like there's a bit more flow to the design. And when you have like the peaks of caves, we can also once again use that as sort of a connects the dots sort of exercise almost, to try to create these more flowy compositions, let's say. All right, finally for set number 7 we have David. And David, I think you know, like, it's a very epic fantasy scene, like feels very old school, which is I think quite appealing. The main suggestions I have, and this is something a lot of people tend to do, we don't always need to close off the borders of a painting. Like, that's not necessary. We can close them off a little bit more subtly by still allowing the smoke and the fog to continue off to the sides, and just having a little bit of variation in the rocks that we spread around. This way we can create a bit more of a open feel as opposed to the very claustrophobic feel. It also tends to feel a bit artificial when we have like this perfect sort of closed off painting, like blocking your edges. It's beneficial sometimes, but it's also not entirely necessary. Another thing with the way you designed the rocks is just a lot of repetition of sort of the same with shapes, which is also not ideal. It tends to feel again a little bit artificial that way as opposed to organic. So more variation in the size of those rocks and the sort of splits that are happening is important to make sure that it does still feel nice and organic. All right, so that's set number 7. Only 2 more to go. All right, so next up we have Helene. And Helene, I think this is a really charming painting. You have a very fun idea. The composition is the main thing I think that at the moment needs work, but the idea is so fun and the color palette works so well. think you'll do fine just making a few adjustments to enhance this composition. So the first thing I've done, as you can see, I've moved things over to the right. The reason for this, once again, we have sort of this side of the composition where all the interesting bits are happening. This side of the composition actually kind of redundant at the moment, especially having the chain be such a big vertical element. It almost feels like you've cropped the painting that way. And we can very quickly resolve that by moving things over to the right hand side. It also allows us to add like a little bit more repeating. Maybe we'll do like another statue like that one over there. Perhaps we can even do like another statue of those ones over here to really frame everything nicely and kind of close the character in with the setting, like the set dressing that we actually have. So that I think is important. The other thing that I want you to do is really think about the pose of the character. Right now he seems to be sort of falling over a little bit, so feet right there, weight entirely to the front, so he's not necessarily moving forward because his feet are just like next to each other and firmly planted. So if you want him to feel a little bit more dynamic, we need to balance that out by poking his butt out backwards, maybe using the tail to our advantage, really getting more of a like a ready to fight sort of pose going. All right. And I think that's the more important part of this specific composition. Also really using, the light to our advantage to help with that. Next up, we have Marin Mohan. And I think your composition, again, this is a situation where it's just really nicely painted, but the character itself, because it's so close to the side and it's also looking to the right hand side, like there's really, like we're drifting off the composition. It's almost like it feels like you've cropped an interesting bit of the scene out. So two options: expand the composition to the right, or maybe even move it to the right by cropping out a part of the tree. So framing it differently, essentially opening up some space in this area, should also definitely help with creating maybe a more coherent flow for the composition. So something like that, for example, I think at least does help with the general feel of the scene. Or, and that's what I've done, you flip the character around so he's looking back at the center of the composition. If you have a character that's looking away from the center, that evokes a certain feeling of, he's leaving something behind, but in this case he's moving towards something, so towards the gate, and I think I would bring that gate back in that case. Also using the light to our advantage a little bit more, the colors. Torch is a very warm light. We can have maybe more of the torch light of something behind there. It seems like there's a fire, or you intended for there to be a fire of some kind behind there. So we can use that to our advantage as well to show off more of the silhouette of the tree, maybe even have some of that light continue past and be thrown onto the floor in front of the character to tie it together. And the tree itself, even though it's very nicely painted, it's not necessarily adding anything to the scene except for, it's so detailed and nicely painted that it feels like a focal point, but it's not necessarily part of the story. So what if we make it part of the story and we actually come up with perhaps like a bunch of little creatures, whether they are cute or whether they are hostile, doesn't matter. That's kind of up to you to choose what you want them to be. But what if you crowd the tree with creatures? Could be crows lurking, could be vultures, could be, again, enemies, could be snakes, and we can really use that to our advantage to add a new level of storytelling to the scene. So now he's not just approaching a dungeon, he's also being stalked, right? Which I think is a good choice to make for this particular scene itself. So next up we have Omar's painting, and Omar's painting I didn't do too much with, partially because, it's again one of those paintings where we don't necessarily have a lot going on. It's a nice painting, the colors feel very nice, but I think compositionally there's maybe a missed opportunity in this case to add an extra level of depth by playing with verticality. Right now the mist layer is sort of preventing that from happening. So what if we have the upper platform and we really have the stairs sort of wrap around and go down quite far, and we play around with like how far down we can actually see. Maybe we'll even see like the stairs go all the way behind there, and we really want to play with that height difference essentially for a scene like this, which I think worked quite well. Another thing that was missing in your original painting is actual lines that show us a little bit of the perspective, so we can use the texture of the cave wall for that. We can use the direction of like multiple peaks poking through the atmosphere for that. So essentially focusing on enhancing that third vanishing point, once again, to add that extra level of depth would be important. Then let's move on to Humberto Rivera's work, which is this one, which is another example of one that's just really nicely made. I think it has a lot of good things going for it. The focal point is obviously the thing that you spend most time on, but I think the composition itself feels a tad bit awkward, because the light that it's like is being cast between here, it's sort of slightly going off to the side as opposed to actually going center, and some of the foreground elements that you have over here also don't necessarily quite work as well. I think this is just kind of crowding the scene. It's creating a little bit of claustrophobia, but not necessarily in the way that we want, because sometimes that can be useful. So I would open up the pathway, use that to our advantage for the perspective, first of all, and we can play with the height with more architectural features. So if you have any sort of details or patterns or columns in mind, this is the area where we can use them. And then perhaps we can even frame that with on the other side, kind of repeating that pattern. But opening it up is the most important bit. Aside from that, I've included a little bit of moonlight coming through, so once again to show a bit of contrast between the warmth and the cools, to enhance the punch of the lighting itself. Moving on, we can have a look at Van's work, and I think the setup here, like, it's very eerie. Like the story that you're trying to tell of the dim torch being in the background, the character being right over there, it's creating a lot of urgency, which I quite like. So very fun storytelling happening. It's a bit too subtle. Like, it's very difficult to see because it's obviously in the dark. But the thing we can do is we can really light up the composition quite a lot more, and maybe I've strayed away a little bit too far from the original intention. But what if we like design the cave so we have another corner somewhere off in the distance, and then our character, or like our companion that's in trouble, is lying right over there in the light. We can still put like the torch somewhere nearby, like the fading torch, if we want to. That's not necessarily an issue, but by having the light around the corner, suddenly we can illuminate the scene a little bit more. The silhouette still allows it to feel quite dark and grim, kind of like what the intention was, and we just have a little bit more information to play with that way. Since a torch isn't like a flashlight, the light is just going in all directions because it's a point light. So the very clear sort of circle around it, that's not necessarily something we'd see. It will be much more of a soft diffusion, right? So we want to have most of the cave of the dungeon be illuminated until we have enough light fall off that it can't reach. And once again, having sort of a torch around the corner hints at perhaps the cave being larger, maybe there being more peril, more dangers happening. Maybe it's just our like third character's torch that fell to the side. Maybe that's what's happened. Maybe that's what's illuminating the cave, right? So, fun idea. I think we just want to show off a little bit more of the environment. Alright, I believe we can then potentially move on to the final group. So for the final group, let's see who we'll start with. We'll probably get ourselves started with Acid Fiend. And your scene is very gorgeous. I like the epicness, I like the color palette. The main suggestion for your scene in particular that I'd have is, once again, it's expanding the canvas, and maybe we'd even benefit from doing that even more, so we once again reveal the feet of our characters. Like the feet of our characters, they're what cements our characters in the environment, so that's not something we would ideally want to lose. So opening up that scene immediately, I think, helps quite a lot. We could also afford to add perhaps more people that are spread around a bit more organically. So what if I add in like another person right over there, maybe like another one that's already a little bit deeper into the scene, and that way we can add more repeating elements that help create that sense of depth that we need. right now, there's an argument to be made that this part of the scene is also perhaps not necessarily adding enough to the composition. So what we can do, and this is what I would do, but obviously you'd have to paint it. I would expand the composition so we can just turn it into a bit more of a symmetrical landscape scene, and you can see how that does help enhancing the scene, making it feel more grand, and just overall its benefits to composition as a whole. So yeah, definitely consider that, I would say. Next up, we can move on to, oh, didn't write a name down for this one. Alright, so this is Dex. Dex, very good job with this painting, very dramatic scene going on, like the ritual to open up the portal. That's a cool touch. I don't think it's quite clear, like when you look at it at first, and once again, it's partially because you're cutting off the legs of the poor man, which is not something I would do. Bring him in frame, turn it into a bit more of a clear, symmetrical thing. You could even go as far as like turning it into like a sort of ritual pattern almost, where you have a bunch of shapes carved into the grooves of the stairs through which the blood is flowing, etc. And that would help quite a lot, I think, with tying this scene together. But the first thing is bring the character within frame. That's, I think, the thing that this scene in particular will benefit from the most, probably. I think next up we can move on to Lucian. And Lucian, in your case, it's a very nice and graphic composition. I think it's the flow, to me, that's not necessarily working yet, because we sort of have divided the canvas into two equal parts. We have the bottom shadowy bit, and then we have the depth of the cave. And I would personally have that sort of loop around a little bit more, because that way we can really create, once again, that flow into the scene rather than just a line into the scene. And I think by extending the path, by getting rid of this one, so we have that starting point going through the curve back into the focal point, I think that works quite well, because if we reach the hands, and the hands will point us into the direction of the leg, which brings us back into the loop that we've set up. And that's sort of how I like to think about creating compositions, creating these loops of points of interest, essentially. Also less sharp of an edge right there, because the thing that's casting the light is quite far away. I even removed it altogether. You can just sort of assume light's coming in from a hole in the cave that's off screen. That's perfectly fine to assume. And also bringing more of the party to the front as well. Like the party over here is all the way in the back. You really lose track of them. And careful of tangents. The sword is sort of barely touching that sort of split in the caverns. But this way I think we get a bit more of an interesting flow to the composition, adding more of a light kind of coming through those spectral hands as well. I think also works quite nicely with like bringing the attention more downwards. One could even argue that in this case as well, we might want to expand the composition downwards as well, to really give it a little bit more breathing room. So you might want to consider that. Next up, I believe this is Kalanarkus. And Kalanarku, in your case, like we've already talked about this a little bit in the group mentorship, but the composition as a whole, like not necessarily anything wrong with that. I just think things to get rid of is probably the more distracting foreground elements, because once again, a foreground element that's just kind of boxing in the scene, it's kind of cropping the composition as opposed to adding to the composition. So I would turn that into more organic, thin, less noticeable foreground elements first of all. But you can see for the most part it's actually the values that I've changed. And if we turn it into black and white, we can really see what I've done, where I've sort of funneled the attention around this central strip of the composition. So we have a dark silhouette for the snake head, framed by the light coming in between the tree trunks. And that's just kind of the atmosphere of the light between the trees that's creating that illumination, essentially, so the dapple of light. And I think that does help quite a lot with just framing the scene in a nice and appealing way. I also got rid of the torches, because I think the torches were creating a added confusing element, because we already have a light source being the pattern in the portal, I think, in this case. So for the portal, we can use that to cast a little bit of light on the bottom of the snake head, and I think that works quite well. We can even use it to cast light on the steps of the snake's body, which works quite well as well. So really just redesigning the shapes of the values, that's the crucial bit in this case. Right. Next up we have, I believe this was Michael's. Probably. Yeah. So yeah, Michael, in your case, we've already talked about this. I provided a different solution in the group mentorship, but in this case, I did want to come up with something else that might help. So the other solution is moving everything to the left-hand side, because this is a focal point. It's once again aiming away from the center of the composition, which kind of creates a block in the flow of our scene. But by having this open up and moving our snipers to the right-hand side, suddenly, you know, we have more of that engagement between the two elements, and I think that does quite help with setting up the scene in a bit more of an appealing way. Then finally, we have Jasper, and Jasper, I think in your case, we've already talked about this as well. The drawing side of things is the thing that I would focus on more. So with the painting, like we can get into that perhaps in the future as well. But right now, I think sorting out the drawing is the first thing we'd want to do. So when we think about the perspective and you set up your horizon line, just imagine that horizon line, like any shape that's close to that horizon line, is going to be fairly narrow and is going to get wider and wider the further we get away from that horizon line. So that means, you know, I have an ellipse that's very squished to an ellipse that's slightly less squished, and it's getting more and more round the further we go down. So the way that translates into the caverns is we have very narrow bends turning wider and wider until we're all the way at the bottom where we can really see the top of the cavern. And that's kind of what we want to focus on. This is still going to go downwards, so we still have the cliffs that we can see, but that's how we should ideally create these caverns in a nice and appealing way. The bridge itself, quite important to get right. Right now it feels like it's bending as opposed to kind of going straight across. So start with just a plane and then use that as a foundation to just sort of sag the bridge between. I think that's going to be your best bet. And, you know, kind of like what I've done right now, using these different colors to block out a composition, block out all of these separate elements, might be very helpful to make sure that things are readable, that there's nothing compromising the readability. Because from the moment I would add in, for example, this tree, I want to make sure that that tree is not impeding with the readability of these other elements. So I need to place that in a way where it is still overlapping perhaps with the background elements, but it's also not like just barely touching any of these other elements that we have. So the placement of that tree in this case I think is slightly problematic because it's creating a bit of a confusion with the cavern itself. Right, so I feel like perhaps we've covered everyone. If I missed anyone, feel free to let me know in the comment section. I will probably be, like I've said, announcing a new challenge in the near future, because I do quite like to have these kind of engagements. And now my schedule is quite busy still, but I have started to manage my time a little bit better. So it might be fun to try a new one. But yeah, thank you guys everyone for joining this challenge. It's been great fun to see all of these submissions. I hope you guys enjoyed it as well, and I hope you found this educational, you found some cool tips. I would recommend listening to the other people's feedbacks as well, and not just scrolling to your own submission, because you can learn quite a lot from just, you know, listening to what other people are getting feedback wise and trying to apply that to how would that work with my own painting essentially. So let me know what you think, if you have any suggestions for changing the format as well. But for now, have a great day, and I hope you guys keep on painting. Take care.